Good evening, everyone, and thank you for being here. I'm Anu Singh, and I work at Carnegie, India, and we're presenting the panel discussion today. Just to first tell you a little bit about Carnegie, we are a New Delhi-based think tank, and we work with leading Indian scholars on three areas: technology and society, political economy, and security studies. We're also fortunate in that we're part of the larger family of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, which is based in DC, but that allows us then to draw on the expertise of our global scholars, while of course remaining firmly focused on issues relevant to India. In Bangalore, we're doubly fortunate to have a relationship already through our Global Technology Summit, which we hold annually every year, usually in early December. And this, of course, is another opportunity for which we're very grateful to engage with an exceptionally well-informed audience here in Bangalore. So thank you all once again for being here. May I now introduce the author of this remarkable book, Arun Mohan Sukumar. Arun is a PhD candidate at the Fletcher School, Tufts University, and a junior fellow at the School Center for International Law and Governance. Formerly, he was heading the technology initiative at the Observer Research Foundation. So, of course, he wears many hats. I request Arun to please come up and introduce his book, Midnight's Machines, A Political History of Technology in India. After his introduction, we will have a panel discussion, and I'll introduce the panelists in a little while, and then we will have 10 or 15 minutes of audience questions. Thank you, Arun.
Of Carnegie India for having me here and to help this setup. Thanks especially to Mr. Ravichandar and the Bangalore International Center for hosting this launch. Really grateful to be here because this book, in some respects, was written for the Bangalore crowd, and it is a privilege to talk about it here in no less a place such as the Bangalore International Center. So very quickly, I can sort of give you a lay of the land about the book, but I'm hoping that we will get into the meat of the discussions with our esteemed panelists here who really, to be honest, I didn't have any role in putting this panel together, but Carnegie and Bangalore International Center have put together a group of exceptional people who can really attack the subject today from various vantage points. And I hope, I would have an opportunity to be informed more about the subjects that I have written myself in the book. That said, this is, the caveat, of course, is that this is a political history. And, whether it differs from any other kind of history, you would probably have to ask who you're speaking to the political scientists. It is eminently about politics. And in some respects, this book is an attempt to understand, to interrogate some terms that have really slipped into the mainstream with very little debate or discussion outside, say, the academia. Scientific temper, for example, is one of them. Jugaad, or frugal innovation, is yet another term that has sort of become part of our mainstream lexicon in a way that we use it in everyday conversations. These terms, the book argues, has a sort of political connotation in the context, the time, the circumstances, and, of course, the political leadership of the time that was invested in putting these narratives, whether it is of frugal innovation, whether it is of scientific temper, before the public, and in convincing the ordinary citizen about the virtues or vices of technology. Mostly, the book argues it was about the vices of technology. And even if it is a political history, one of the criticisms that has come in of the book is that it looks at a history of technology in independent India from the vantage point, from the lens of the state. And I think that is a fair accusation, given that the state was forged in India in 1947 out of, there is of course a freedom movement, but it brings together the many cleavages that mark India in 1947 and bring them together to cobble them together to create the modern state. And therefore politics does not dissipate at all in 1947, whether it is relating to questions of domestic politics, foreign policy, industrial policy, or questions of technology. And this book begins by looking at the various strands of thought that characterized industrialization and attitude towards technology from independence. Of course, the man who steered it all from 1947 till his death in 1964 was Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, and the book goes in some detail analyzing his views on technology, given that they were so singularly influential in charting the trajectory of the modern Indian economy in all respects, including in technology. But it also attempts to look at certain narratives that have been studied, and I should also, if you are interested in picking up the book, also say that in many respects I am standing on the shoulders of giants while writing, while having written this book. The history of the atomic and the space programs in India, for example, is well documented. A lot of them, unfortunately, are hagiographies, but we have exceptional books that have been written on these two remarkable successes, but exceptional successes. Professor Phalkey's book is one of them. Robert Anderson's book, Nucleus and Nation, is another one. And there are several books that have been written on the formation of the Indian state and its attitude towards science and technology. More science, I would say the pure sciences, and less so technology. The conversation, I wouldn't say it sort of ends there, but it certainly tapers off. You hear very little about the conversations on technology that happened during Indira Gandhi's time, with the vantage point of politics, being the animating, the thread that connects it together. We, of course, know about technological advancements in India, but the objective of this book is to show the successes and many failures of attempts by India, by the Indian state, to incubate technology. And of course, given that I write this as any historian does, with the wisdom of hindsight and the distance of time, and the perspective of distance, rather, it is, of course, impossible for me to say, for example, Nehru should have been more welcoming of private industry and entrepreneurship in the decades that he was in power. I can say that, it was, I can be critical of the Indira Gandhi government in its attitude towards computers, as to how it essentially was hijacked by the automation protests led by labor unions and trade unions in the 60s and the 70s, and how it was co-opted by these movements, and in turn co-opted other global movements to tell the ordinary Indian citizen that computers are bad, despite the fact that government reports of the time itself made it clear that computers were not going to have any, or automation was not going to have any visible effects or visible decreases in jobs in public sector units. There are structural considerations. So, I mean, my point is only to say that I can be critical of political leaders and governments of the day, but it is also important for us to understand the structural factors that led to the embrace or rejection of technologies by India. And this story begins just before 1947 in some respects. We attained independence on the back of, an enervating war from which most of the major powers, except, say, with the exception of the United States, found themselves considerably weakened. Post-war Europe was in ruins, and although the Second World War heralded the atomic age by dropping atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, many of the technologies that we felt could be useful to us in nation building, or perhaps were overtly promised to us by the United Kingdom or other countries that belong to the developed countries that belong to the Commonwealth, did not come to us, because the Second World War's end also coincides with the beginning of the Cold War. So there are structural considerations. Another one, which is fairly important, is the fact that we didn't have money. Britain owed India something to the tune of $5 billion at the end of the Second World War by way of reparations for services performed by Indian soldiers at the end in theaters of conflict in the Second World War. And if this amount was withdrawn by India, so to speak, from the treasury of the United Kingdom, the UK economy would have collapsed overnight. So what happens is a secret agreement between the United Kingdom and the United States, preventing conversion of the sterling to dollars, which limits structurally the access that we have to new technologies, because we needed technologies from the United States in order to, if at all we were inclined to purchase it from the United States, money to buy it from the West. So there are these, then of course, another structural consideration is the rise of export control regimes at that time. The historian Robert Anderson, for example, documents how Shanti Swarup Bhatnagar, the first director of what would be the CSIR, he was part of secret visits, visits by secret delegations to Project Manhattan, laboratories that were involved in the creation of the bomb in the United States. But later, when somebody like Homi Bhabha wants to apply for an import license for so much as a plastic balloon for his experiments, he's denied a license. So it is not as if the transfer of technology that characterized the Second World War. And most modern technologies that we know today were in some form or the other incubated by the Second World War. Food processing, plastics, pesticides, DDT, microwave technology, radar, jet propulsion, you name it. Most of these technologies were provided free of cost by the United Kingdom to the US in an effort to lure DC into joining the Second World War, into fighting Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. These technology transfers, which were free and relatively unencumbered, did not happen at the end of the Second World War, and certainly did not happen after India attained independence. So once the tap had dried up, there were these structural limitations for India to absorb new technologies to modernize its economy. And it is in this context that the growth of India's, or rather the trajectory of India's attempts to navigate export controls, budgetary constraints, to absorb technologies, all of this happens under this environment. Added to which, and this is really the politics of it, the personal, philosophical, ideological predilections of the leaders of the time make and the book's argument is that there is a deep mistrust in the leadership, in the political class and among the political elites in India, who have who have taken the reins of independent India immediately after 1947, and led by, of course, Nehru. And there are various reasons why Nehru asks the citizenry to be mistrustful or at least be skeptical of technologies. One, of course, is political. He is the Mahatma's chosen political heir, and the Gandhian view towards machines is famous and is well known. And the fact that Nehru derived political legitimacy from Mahatma Gandhi made it untenable for him to advocate industrialization and mechanization in any serious way. So Nehru performs this fine balancing act, and perhaps we can get to it. There are also personal reasons. This Aristotelian view that Nehru had, that technology would enslave a population if they did not understand how to use it. Now, this was a tall order when the lifespan of the average Indian citizen at the end of independence, at the time of independence, was 35 to 40 years old. So it is a tall order, but nevertheless, the Indian establishment persists with certain naive, one could say, projects to incubate technology. The book talks about attempt to create a solar cooker, the prototype of which never entered the market. So on March 21, 1952, there's an announcement at the Times of India that the Prime Minister had boiled cabbages and vegetables the previous night thanks to the solar cooker. Now, the book calls it the first scam the first technology scam of independent India, but this Times of India report could well also be the first instance of fake news in India, because there is no real prototype that is visible to the market. There is no the model that is sold in the market to the ordinary Indian citizen. That's because this technology is far ahead of its time. Solar technology at that time, to capture solar technology, let alone miniaturize it into a solar cooker, is a far-fetched exercise. Nevertheless, folks like Nehru and Shanti Bhatnagar, who's his lieutenant at CSIR, attempt to invest political capital and attempt to, bulldoze this project through, with the end result that they are ultimately, especially Nehru, is disillusioned with the state of scientific research in India. Added to that, later circumstances such as, the CSIR themselves, the laboratories become mired in allegations of corruption, and it's all downhill from there. The early 60s, Nehru says, all is not well with the laboratory. So there is this period, which the book calls the Age of Innocence, where Indian scientists, perhaps looking at their counterparts in the West, felt that they were invulnerable and could perhaps repeat the miraculous stuff that was being conducted, the experiments that were conducted in the United States and the United Kingdom. But this was not to be because, for all the reasons that we mentioned, access to money, the fact that we did not have a military-industrial complex, so to speak of, because our colonizers had ensured that, we had no scientific or industrial wherewithal to incubate research into the pure sciences. And and the first phase of the book ends with the war with China, where we are we become aware of the acute lack of electronics production in India, our inability to produce electronics for the market, and that begins a great deal of soul searching and introspection among India's bureaucrats as well as the military establishment. And that's where really the Babus step in, and that's the title of the chapter. And this is a period from 1962 till the end of the emergency is a period that is characterized by the heavy involvement of the state. The license Raj, of course, was always there in some form, but of course is now tightened and is given an impetus by Indira Gandhi's government when she assumes power in 1966. Again, there are structural considerations here. A fact is that this period was a failure when it comes to technological advancement in what can be called as everyday technologies, civilian-facing technologies. It's also the time that there were considerable advancements in India's space and nuclear programs. So on the one hand, the government is telling the citizens during this period to be wary of big machines while investing in big machinery in, nation-building projects. Although as is now famously said, India's nuclear program did not contribute even a single megawatt of electricity to the country's grids for the first 2 decades of its operations. So it is perhaps a tale of hypocrisy in the ensuing decades, but whatever it is, it goes a great deal to sow the seed of doubt in the mind of the Indian citizen about the utility of technology. And hence this phase in the book is called The Age of Doubt. And this is also the period, again, the external circumstances are important. India was buffeted by back-to-back famines in 1965 and 1966, which made our already strained economy in even more precarious position. Export control regimes, of course, continue to be fortified by the United States and the USSR. There are shocks to the dollar that are introduced by President Nixon. So there are all these extraneous considerations which make the pursuit of technology difficult by the Indian state. And this is a common refrain throughout the book. And perhaps in some respects, the modest advancements that we've made in technology, in acquiring technologies. For example, one of the examples that is cited in the book is that of the Colombo Plan, which was a diplomatic endeavor created by the UK and its developed ally friends in the Commonwealth, but which Nehru and his diplomatic cadre, tweaked extraordinarily well to ensure that the Colombo Plan became the receptacle for some truly important technologies for India. So under the Colombo Plan, Canada supplies $5 million worth of buses and trucks to seed urban transportation in Bombay. And that's how, that is how bus transportation in Bombay is started. You talk about the IITs. The role of foreign collaboration in the IITs, unfortunately, today has been relegated to a footnote in this conversation on self-reliance and whatnot. But the fact is that IIT Bombay was created with the help of the Soviet Union. IIT Kanpur with the help of the Americans, IIT Delhi with that of the UK. IIT Kharagpur had all the major powers, France, the Soviet Union, the US, and West Germany helping us at various points of time, and IIT Madras with the help of West Germany. So despite the position that we took during the Cold War of non-alignment, and despite the difficult extraneous circumstances that we were faced, it is to the credit of the Indian government at that time that we were able to navigate such fractious geopolitics and manage to secure technologies that were important to us, but perhaps not enough. And so this is really the beginning of India's technological, the story of India's technological advancement, and perhaps we can get into the story of computers, the Human Genome Project, and all the conversations that happened in the 80s and the 90s over the course of the conversation. But I hope you will. I suppose the big takeaway, whether you get the book or not, is that the role of politics in our conversations on technology has relatively, one would modestly say that there are few examinations or analysis that look at the important role of politics in determining the technological trajectory of India. Hopefully, this will be a conversation starter, building on the incredible work of other scholars, looking at the growth of certain technologies, certain sectors in India. But the objective of this book has been to piece together the strands of politics that either led to us embracing or rejecting technologies. Thank you.
Thank you, Arun. You really have, I hope you haven't impacted the sales of your book, because you've given such a beautiful sort of broad stroke description of the book. But of course, the book has much, much, much more. Now to introduce the panel, we have with us Dr. Rajeev Gowda, a member of the Rajya Sabha and national spokesperson of the Indian National Congress. I'm very well aware that Dr. Gowda requires no introduction anywhere in India, but particularly in Bangalore. Yet, I am going to introduce him a little bit. He also currently serves as chairman of the Congress Research Department. He's also advisor for Bridge India, a progressive non-profit think tank. Dr. Gowda has been a professor of economics and social sciences and the chairperson of the Center for Public Policy at the Indian Institute of Management in Bangalore here, and has also served as the director of the Central Board Reserve Bank of India. Welcome, Dr. Gowda. Thank you for being here. And we have with us Jahnavi Phalkey, a filmmaker and a historian of science and technology. She is the director of the documentary film Cyclotron, made in 2017. Formerly at King's College, London, she is now the founding director of Science Gallery here, Bengaluru, and the Sir Ashutosh Mukherjee Visiting Professor at the Indian Institute of Advanced Studies. Welcome, Jahnavi. And also welcoming Dr. Susmita Mohanty, a spaceship designer, serial space entrepreneur, and a climate change advocate, now in her most recent avatar. Susmita is well known for her research on space-related topics. She co-founded India's first private space startup, Earth to Orbit, in 2009. But remarkably, she's the only space entrepreneur in the world to have started companies on 3 different continents, Asia, Europe, and North America. And to add to that, she's one of the few people in this world to have visited both the Arctic and the Antarctic. Thank you all for being here. Arun, you were very modest in giving out the criticism against your book, that it was the perspective of the state, but I've also read a few reviews of your book, and most of them are very flattering. But the sort of theme that seemed to run through the reviews is also that, you know, here's a book that should have been written long ago, and finally this book is here. So I just want to begin by asking you, what is it that really led you to writing this book, sort of honing into this idea? Was it a moment of epiphany, or you have been working in this area for a while?
No, I wish there was something dramatic as that, but unfortunately that's not the case. In fact, I made the mistake of working on a book that has nothing to do with my PhD, and now I have to I have to head back to the dreary world of the academia soon after this. But one of the reasons why I pursued this as a subject that could potentially become a book, and it was over the the course of many conversations with Penguin, my publisher, that we arrived at the final form, was and as you said, until recently I was with a think tank in Delhi called the Observer Research Foundation, and heading their technology program. And as a public policy analyst, and Professor Gowda can also speak to this, we are always confronted by the immediate. And you are, for example, working on issues like Aadhaar, on data protection, on emerging technologies such as AI or blockchain. Now, you may have you may or may not have competence to speak about these technologies, but the nature of public policy analysis is that it expects answers out of you. And to a certain degree, it was frustrating for me to analyze these technologies
technologies in the immediacy of the present, given that I knew somewhere in the back of my mind that all of these technologies, biometrics, for example, has such a rich and checkered history in India. And India is the site where fingerprinting was implemented at the scale for the first time in 1870s. Now, to really understand how we are here, I think we should, perhaps to understand our past is important in that it would illuminate our analysis of public policy, and that's really the motivation. I had no idea whether this would take the form that it did, but my interest was also piqued by the fact that, for example, I was working in Delhi responding to a government that continues to be, of course, it has embraced technologies, but has no hesitations to my mind, in politicizing the implementation of technologies. And I figured that this would not have been the first government to do it in various, severity or intensity. And, I felt this is a story to be told, and clearly it was.
Thank you. Because history is so important to the here and now, we'll go back exactly to the start of the book, where you begin, and you've referred to it in your introduction, about how Pandit Nehru was, even before independence, he headed the National Planning Committee, and after he became Prime Minister, he also continued to hold the portfolio of scientific research. And you say, and I'm quoting here, that Nehru singularly and decisively chartered the trajectory of India's technological progress at that point. So, Dr. Gowda, if I may ask you, because you're a policy maker, does policy depend so much on a single person? And, or it's more a combination of, say, a council, but also circumstances, and many other things. I mean, what role would any one person have to play?
Well, I'd say that leadership, certainly, and in combination with vision, in combination with stature and respect and that the person commands, could play a very, very significant role in terms of building institutions, in terms of unleashing the technological trajectory that India took. In that sense, I think we were extraordinarily lucky to have someone like Jawaharlal Nehru. And he was lucky to have a whole set of others around him, Bhabha, Sarabhai, Bhatnagar, a whole variety of names that come to mind, who built institutions, and took the shared vision forward in some ways. And so in that sense, I would say that great men, great people, would have a very, very significant impact. But you must also remember that Nehru was doing all this alongside nurturing democracy, many of the things that he mentioned in his introduction. He was constrained by being, the chosen heir of Mahatma Gandhi. And if you were to look at a counterfactual, Gandhiji's vision of industrialization or harnessing of technology would have kept us maybe where Myanmar is today or something like that. I don't want to say anything particularly negative here, but the point is, it's nice to look back after 75 years, but the fact is that many of these things were established in parallel with attempts to deal with mass challenges, right? You might wonder, how can a poor nation spend money on atomic energy, on a space program, or anything like that, or on institutes like the variety of institutes that have been set up over the years. There was a certain amount of backing, financial and everything else. And I'd like to say, in fact, in response to his point about we managed to get support for the IITs from different countries, that was not despite non-alignment. It was, because of non-alignment, we were able to literally play countries off against one another in some sense. And the historical context is that we were emerging from a period where we wanted nothing to do with the Cold War or take one side or the other. It caused us a lot of trouble, geopolitically. But we were able to sort of leverage in spite of that. And part of that is because Nehru's stature internationally was very, very substantial. And I do think that you are sometimes a little unkind to him in your book.
Thank you, Dr. Gowda. So in the same vein, you know, we have a history of technology policy. Other countries, presumably, also have a history. So Jahnavi, as a historian of science and technology, would you do a little comparison for us with some of the journeys of the other?
So you said that this is a political story, and we all seem to agree on that point. And it couldn't be anything other than a political story. Also, not simply because technologies are political by nature, but because the Manhattan Project was an unprecedented project on a global scale during the Second World War. So you saw the kind of investment. So there were not comparisons. There were quantifications of the budget or the kind of money that was poured into the Manhattan Project, right? Which involved several countries and experts and theoreticians and physicists and engineers also from several countries coming together. So at some point it was estimated to be 4 times the budget of peacetime Norway or 6 times the budget of British India, etc. Numbers notwithstanding, they were massive, right? So what we notice here is that there's an internationalism. There's also a science and engineering project to build research technologies that cuts across countries, right? And science, technology, and the state, or science, engineering, and the state come together like never before. So you did have Fritz Haber and chemical weapons during the First World War, but what came together during the Second World War was unprecedented. And the coming to the fusion of science and state makes it a political story worldwide, right? And so the Indian trajectory is no different to this trajectory. So even if you look at what happened, say, so the Manhattan Project, of course, has its own trajectories that get played out in India, and some of them, those you pull out in your book. Sputnik, right? So the Americans are not expecting the Soviets to have a bomb anytime soon. 49, they test, throws the Americans into a tizzy. 57, Sputnik, and the Americans are like, okay, the Soviets are there. And then you have John F. Kennedy announcing, we'll put a man on the moon. So what's the Cold War technology goal? Right? It's putting a man on the moon. So the political goal of a state, the political ambition of a state now is a technological ambition, right? And that's why the technological story of the later half of the 20th century is a political one, and it's therefore also political in India, right? The second aspect to this is also that of centralization. So while we in India have constantly argued, for example, and those who know me have heard me say this several times, is that the Indian state came and centralized research funding. There was CSIR, there was the Department of Atomic Energy and the space program, and all money went into one facility. Look at Europe. What was the European answer? It was CERN. It was countries coming together to build facilities. Apart from the United Nations, there was no economy at that point of time which could conduct scientific research at the scale, the tone for which was set during the Second World War. And therefore, the solution of centralization that was adopted also in India was no different to what was happening globally, right? And so I think teasing out these strands of what was actually, happening in India was not an anomaly. It is a part of that larger story, and it keeps weaving in and out of that story as well, right? I mean, you're looking at, just to add a footnote to the Nehru question, right? I mean, Nehru spoke science. He set scientific temper, but look at the institutions he established. The Indian Institutes of Technology. It took us 60 years after independence to establish the Indian Institutes of Science, Education, and Research, right? The Council for Scientific and Industrial Research. Scientific and industrial research, right? This is, again, a focus on technology. We didn't go for the Max Planck Institute's model, or the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute's model. We didn't follow the Harnack principle. We didn't go for the German model. We went for the industrial research model, right? So technology, I mean, so the accusation sometimes that Nehru spoke science, didn't do technology, is actually not held out because the institutions he established, I mean, the IISc is 50 years prior to independence, or nearly 50 years prior to independence, but the key institutions that he put in place, or he and his government, and his, including the people that were just named, and Mahalanobis is one I would add to that, are people who are working at the interface of science and technology, because that's the nature of scientific and engineering research in the 20th century, right? You can't imagine CERN without huge amounts of technology and engineering. You can't imagine a space program without huge amounts of technology and engineering, right? And so, in a way, the science and technology question in the later half of the 20th century is internationally is a sort of very complex, well, no, maybe it's intertwined.
So yeah, to that...
Anu, I just wanted to set me thinking what you asked me earlier and what she's just mentioned. When you think about Nehru's push in different directions, and that's where a book like this could add a lot more detail, we know about dairy, we know about Korean, we know about Amul. But before that, my father's late elder brother was a junior minister in Nehru's cabinet. And he sent him to Denmark and this whole hybrid, cattle and things like that. And he founded the dairy movement in Karnataka. And that was all stuff that happened before what we know more popularly happened. So I think this emphasis on taking care of the needs of the masses in some ways actually panned out, maybe a little later. But this is something that's worth looking at in more detail.
And in this same, just picking up, Jahnavi, from what you said about, how technology developed in certain similar ways through, in different countries, I'm just quoting once again about a quote that you used from the current foreign minister, Mr. Jaishankar, at, in fact, Carnegie's Global Technology Summit in 2017, where he says that the history of international affairs is in many ways the history of technology. So you seem to agree with that. And now I'm going to ask Susmita, since you have interfaced with technology policy over 3 continents, would you also agree that there's, very close links and that India is very much part of the international story?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, especially when it comes to space. But before I respond to that particular aspect, I think I need to put things in perspective a little bit when it comes to the world of space. So if you look at spacefaring nations around the world, India easily ranks in the top 5 to 6 nations, both in terms of technological capabilities and the budget allocation. The NASA has an annual budget about 19 billion. The European Space Agency, which has 20 plus member states, it's roughly about 5 billion plus. France is around 2.75 plus or minus. Japan is 1.75. We're talking billions of dollars, and India is 1.5. And India also happens to be one of 7 launch-capable countries, which is the big deal. If you can launch things into orbit, that's the ultimate technological capability to have. So we are one of 7, and that includes Israel and Iran. Now, coming back to your question, I think the whole thing around international affairs and development of space technologies, Arun did mention the very important word export control that anyone in the space world is familiar with. What that means is if this microphone is made in the United States and I want to launch it on an Indian rocket, it becomes a defense article. And I need to go through all kinds of clearances to be able to fly this on a foreign rocket. So I think a lot of us forget, for example, a lot of international diplomacy, even this time when Trump was in town, one of the things on their list of things that they discuss is usually space is one of the things. When Obama visited in 2010, that was, I was involved because I returned to India in 2008. And one of the first missions I took up after coming back was to see how can we make the PSLV, our rocket which we use for launching Earth observation satellites, one of the leading rockets in its class. Typically, a country has 2 rockets, one to launch ComSats at 36,000 kilometers, and the other one is for Earth observation satellites, which is the PSLV. So the 3 hurdles that I was up against in order to make that happen, one is the 1998 US embargo, which, by the way, still exists. It was imposed on us because we conducted nuclear tests. That was one big hurdle. Under this embargo, American companies are not allowed to sell space components to India. So let alone launching an American satellite on an Indian rocket. That was out of question. The second was export control, ITAR. It was written in the 60s during the Cold War. And it still exists. Obama tried to play with it a little bit, but nobody touches ITAR pretty much. What ITAR does is the security clearance you need for a rocket engine versus, say, an astronaut diaper are pretty much as cumbersome. And the third hurdle, of course, again, internationally speaking, is about not letting business leave the country. So the SpaceXs and the Boeings of the world lobby hard and spend millions in making sure that business doesn't leave the country. So yes, international affairs and space are intermingled in a very, very intricate way.
But what about beyond space, other technologies? How do we, and Jahnavi, anybody please, how do we compare in our history of other technologies? And I ask particularly because in the book, the solar, and in your talk as well, the solar cooker was perhaps the other end of the spectrum from the space technologies. And it was an attempt, genuine or not, to bring technology to the ordinary person. And it failed spectacularly, as you say. And as a result of it, you also say that the scientists and the researchers retreated back into their ivory towers and did not, after that, for some time, make any more such attempts. So how does our history of the everyday thing, the ordinary technology, compare with the other countries? And particularly also in terms of, this privatization of technology. How do we compare on that front?
So may I say a little bit about the privatization bit? I think I'll leave to you because, yeah, absolutely, we have an expert in the room. So I think, to my mind, so if you look at the kind of investment that was made into the setting up of the Indian Institutes of Technology, at the same time, another effort was put, which we have historically not only neglected, but forgotten and continue to not pay attention to, which is an anagram of the IITs, the ITIs, right? The kind of money that should have gone into and the kind of attention that could have gone into the ITIs would have ensured a workforce capable of good quality industrialization and a manufacturing base, and that did not happen. So if you start comparing the histories of the processes of industrialization, not so much the trajectories, because, and this was the question that Nehru and his colleagues faced, which is, do you now introduce the various processes of modernization simultaneously or sequentially? What comes after what, right? Which was a certain reading of European history. Do you leave out, what do you leave out and what do you keep, right? And these were not questions to which there were ready or even good known answers, right? It was a difficult thing to predict or even grapple with. In the absence of trained manpower, I mean, you had like 3 properly trained nuclear physicists in the country in 1947, right? 3. So this is not, the answer wasn't trivial. I think if we look at the processes of industrialization in other countries, the transition from craft to industry is a strong one. What happened in India is that transition, not only did that transition not happen, but that connection broke. And with the arrival of modern engineering education, it slipped out of the hands of the craftspeople almost entirely, and we see the consequences today for that, right? I mean, our windows don't close properly, or, everybody in this room knows what happens.
Yeah, I think, so the solar cooker is certainly an instance that perhaps, I think, the interview that, the quote that is from a CSIR scientist at that time is given to Shiv Vishwanathan, who chronicled the CSIR in the early 80s. And he says, the scientist who was working in the solar cooker project, he said, the failure of the cooker basically ensured that all the scientists retreated into the comfort of the lab, and it put them off, quote unquote, applied science altogether. So here's a project that is commenced almost immediately after independence, meant to create, in some respects, technology by Indians for Indians. And the fact that it had, it was, for various reasons it failed, it really, perhaps the political spotlight that had been put on the project was counterproductive. Nehru himself investing this kind of capital exposed him and the scientific establishment to criticism that they perhaps were not used to, because these were venerated men and women, mostly men, in the field, and they were perhaps unused to being accountable in this visceral way. So, India offered a prototype of the solar cooker to Egypt and I believe Rhodesia or South Africa, and the joke goes that the order was never repeated again. Didi Kosambi says in an opinion piece at the time that the only person who made any profit out of the solar cooker affair is the contractor who sold it for scrap. So this is the kind of criticism that is confronted by the scientific establishment, and it is a consequence of politics. And I agree with Professor Phalkey when she says it. Perhaps that it was, it was a consequence of the political establishment not insulating the scientific establishment from this sort of, criticism, which may or may not be informed, but, how the press is. That led to a gradual breaking of ranks between, say, the CSIR and the political vision for India, where, you would have these mass technologies that you mentioned. And then you can see it. The best evidence for that is Nehru's pursuit of massive industrialization in the second five-year plan from 1956 to 61. So the seeds are already sown there with the, and this is not to say that, Nehru himself was surrounded by advisors who believed all in the same thing. There were, of course, like Mahalanobis who believed in a more, an aggressive form of industrialization. So perhaps at various points of time, one constituency was trumping another within even the establishment. But, I think it needs to be said that the Prime Minister was not in favor of introducing tractors into, agricultural land. Again, this is all criticism from the wisdom of hindsight. It is known, for example, that the introduction of tractors in Latin America and so on increased income inequality, increased. So all of those criticisms apply, but the fact is that there was a certain reluctance to introduce technology in a serious and sustained way to the masses. And these household appliances that were, projected as solutions just did not work. And with respect to what happened in other countries, I think the role of the war is serially underplayed. The American story is, of course, a success story, but the fact is that it is the Second World War that seeded not just the military technologies, but also the civilian technologies that I spoke about. The fact is that at the end of the Second World War, the United States and the USSR documented effort to ensure that Nazi scientists are taken from Germany and brought back and rehabilitated in the United States. I wonder whether NASA would have the existence that it has today had it not been for the efforts of Werner Braun and other Nazi scientists who were rehabilitated in cities like Alabama.
This is why the Germans believe they went to the moon.
So these circumstances were just not available for India.
Well, but Arun, don't you think the solar cooker, whatever that is as an example, was may have been naive, may have been way ahead of its time, but they should not fault the vision, the fact that they were thinking of something like that. We are still providing, LPG connections to people in villages at this stage. Forget something renewable.
If I
privatization?
may quickly add, yes, I think privatization and even just taking, the discussion around from craft to technology to industrialization. There's one other important thing that I've observed since my school days. In India, we have a mindset problem. We have a cultural problem, and I'll tell you what that is. I like the idea of jugaad. I think jugaad is something you do when you lack resources and your necessity gets you to invent something. But I am not the biggest fan of jugaad. Here is why. I think prototyping an idea, you start with an idea and you build a prototype. And to build something with precision takes a lot of patience and tenacity and attention to detail, and we culturally are lacking that. And we lack it even today, which is why we start with Make in India and end up with Assemble in India. So I think we have a mindset problem, a cultural problem. But anyway, now coming to privatization. So I think we are very bad, at least when it comes to the space world. I grew up with ISRO in the early 70s, and I've seen it evolve. Ideally, we should have started privatizing some of our routine satellite assembly and rocket assembly in the early part of the century. We are very late in the game. If you look at the history of privatization in the US or Europe, to some extent even Japan, we have really been delayed by almost 2 decades, if you ask me. Which is a problem because today you have about 15,800 people working at ISRO. But if we had privatized, say, early part of the century, we could have had a lot more meaningful jobs for young people in this very country. And privatization is different from commercialization. I differentiate between the two, and we haven't done that. We don't believe in our young people being able to build satellites and habitats and rockets and get on with it. We're still very protective about our programs. That's the problem.
So another fatal flaw, if Jugaad is one, this protective attitude, but why do you think? I mean, is it historical, cultural? What is it? Is it something that was told to us and which we have imbibed and are unable to?
I think it's cultural. I really think it's cultural. For example, ISRO gave out the first contract for private assembly of satellites 2 years ago to a consortium of companies. If this was in the US or in Europe, ideally the contract would have enough money for you as a consortium to have your own clean room to assemble and to do other things. Here, they expect you to come into ISRO and do everything under their very noses. I mean, it's really like being overprotective parents. I think it's cultural more than anything else. And the appetite for risk is much better now than it was earlier, but I think it's really cultural. And it's a big problem, if you ask me.
See, I don't know enough about this, but there was a private arm of ISRO, Antrix, which got embroiled in some scandals of their own. And so the moment something like that happens, then the establishment is not going to go anywhere closer towards privatization or anything like that. And now you're seeing that in the context of defense production. We want to ensure that we create a big, essentially infrastructure of companies, but the way that's moving forward, the players involved, all this has turned it into a big mess.
But I should add, Antrix has become people think of Antrix as the private arm of ISRO. It's not. It's just a window to ISRO for selling spare capacity. So it's not a company at all. So one shouldn't compare Antrix to Boeing or Airbus or any of those things.
It's just that in the policy-making world, nobody gets those finer details. It's just, broadband, one thing gets, painted with something else. No, I first encountered Antrix and their team when I was a professor at Oklahoma. And India was, actually ISRO set up a ground receiving station there. And they were selling data to the rest of the world and things of that sort. So I was very impressed. This was in the 90s, I think. It's a long time ago.
So I just to add a footnote to that, so I have very little to say about the lack of or the trajectory of privatization in India. But I think if we look at, since we are talking about sectors like space, and maybe we can go to solar cooker later or something else later. If you look at the structures under which these industries are administered, also in the United States or in Europe, there's very, very heavy state involvement. The contracts are, so I'm not saying that, they're heavy. So, these dual-use technologies or defense-related technologies almost always are regulated in ways in which, and, we were reminded much more of that in the early years of independence, much less so now. But the constant sort of, the tone of our argument is one of where dependence is a problem. Not being able to self-sustain or rely on oneself is a problem, and therefore one should be in control. And I think it comes from that spirit. If you look at the 70s, right? I mean, the number of democratic regimes that fell or were made to fall, so the hot wars fall. The hot wars fought during the Cold War in the rest of the world. One starts to see why the need for control was felt. Now, when that should be let go, when that should not be let go, etc., are decisions of judgment, of politics, of political trajectories, interests, group interests, range of things that need to come together, which one can parse out on a case-by-case basis. But there's something behind there which I think does need to be taken quite seriously, especially for dual use or dual applicability technology.
See, on the private sector participation side, as Jahnavi just pointed out, the US, while you might hear of a Boeing, a Raytheon, a whole bunch of private sector companies, they're very closely, it's the military-industrial complex, as Eisenhower said it. And when we talk about iron triangles and interest groups in political science classes, we're talking about those examples where it's government money being funneled into private enterprise in some ways. But in India, where has private sector ever wanted to pursue anything of this sort? It's not even that there was a demand right from the time of the Bombay Plan or whatever, the early days, just before independence, in fact. And even today, if you were to look at the allocation in the private sector to R&D, it's negligible. So it's, so as a nation, we've sort of missed out, and we've been reliant on the government and to play the, to occupy the commanding heights, as it were.
Another dimension, of course, is the presence of universities. In the United States, they were the incubators of the military-industrial complex. So Harvard and MIT in Boston, and Stanford in Silicon Valley, which were essentially the nucleus for research. In India, again, some of these are truly unfortunate circumstances that have, the government has no control over. So when the first batch of graduates pass out of IIT Kanpur in 1965, that's the same year that Lyndon B. Johnson passes the Immigration and Nationalization Act, giving Indians and other nationalities automatic path to citizenship. So the best minds of our country are, of course, prompted by the fact that there are not enough jobs or not perhaps well-paying jobs in India, but there is now a feeder line that is created between India and the United States, from which is very difficult to come back. So those circumstances too, I guess, must be acknowledged in the final analysis.
Yeah, actually, that after 30 years or so has paid off. Just paid off not necessarily in terms of those lost brains coming back, but just the fact that they turned entrepreneurial, that they turned their brains into dollars or billions of dollars, whatever, that signaling effect, the fact that it's turned a large number of people here into potential entrepreneurs, that created a startup boom, etc., that could compensate to some extent, but that's a loss of a lot of very, very good talent. Yeah.
Can I just quickly add? I think even brain drain is hugely exaggerated. I've lived in 4 different countries, and I think the talent pool we have in India today is as big or bigger. So yes, there are people leaving the country, but not everyone is the best coder in town.
Talking about this period, Jahnavi referred to it, and this brain drain after the IITs were set up and the first batches graduated. And then in the 70s, you talk about this concept of appropriate technology. So were the two in a way connected? That the fact that, also, maybe I'm drawing a rather long thread here, but that, on the one hand, perhaps because of this concept, and I'd get you to explain it a bit more, this appropriate technology, there weren't enough jobs, or that, that was the mindset and there was no hope, and so, so many of our best brains.
It is true. I think also the appropriate technology movement, which sort of started in the 70s, in the late 60s, the early 70s, was this philosophy that grew out of Western Europe and the United States, which called for lesser consumption of natural resources, labor-intensive jobs, with a view to conserving resources for the planet. And it was a lot of this was precipitated by the Club of Rome's report called Limits to Growth, which essentially predicted this catastrophe that would befall humanity by 2080. And and then Ernst Schumacher, an economist, writes this book called Small is Beautiful and creates a revolution. Incidentally, not just in advanced societies, but also in developing countries where leaders like Indira Gandhi co-opt the appropriate technology movement, that is the argument of the book, to say to the people that, you should consume less, you should conserve your natural resources, deploy labor-intensive technologies that will essentially be beneficial to you and your way of life. So, this would have been the analysis, or rather the embrace of the government at that time of appropriate technology. And there are, there's plenty of evidence to back this up. seminar after seminar is sponsored by the top institutes of that time to talk about how you can create fuel out of biogas, how you can mechanize bullock carts, technologies that are not scalable, but nevertheless are quick fixes. And that is, in some respects, it's also the book's argument that this is where Jugaad really sort of has its historical origin. This valorization of frugal innovation, make do with what you have, really begins in the 70s. And this would be acceptable had it not been for the fact that at the same time, the investments in the space and the nuclear programs continued unabated under Indira Gandhi's term. I mean, to varying degrees, but in the 70s you saw the seeding of the satellite program, the atomic program, although it did not bear fruit in a significant way, continue to see investments by the state. So on the one hand, the state was promoting big science. So it wasn't as if they had an ideological or a political compulsion against big machines and big technologies. It is just that there were factors such as financial considerations and its own inability to develop technology at home, which I argue, led for the Indira Gandhi government to cooperate this appropriate technology movement. And, this had very different outcomes in different parts of the world. For example, the counterculture movement, which gave birth to, or is the sister of the appropriate technology movement, gave birth to Silicon Valley. And, that too was a revolt against the big machines. The guys in Silicon Valley rebelled against IBM and came up with their own products. In India, of course, perhaps it's harsh to say that we moved backwards, but the objective was not to redefine technology, but to shun it altogether. And that, unfortunately, is I feel is a byproduct of the legacy of the 70s. So, in the newspapers, we hear every year about an IIT student who has done this magnificent project about, a robot that runs on biofuel or, getting, small stuff that can genuinely be classified as inventions, but clearly are not scalable. So one should do a research project worth undertaking is to see what happens to the student from the IIT, whether he or she is really scaling up this project or to, whether they are employed in some big technology companies. So that government telling, the citizen that scale is bad, I think was to the detriment of our trajectory as advanced society.
So I have to disagree. Because, as Rahul and I have been discussing, there's been only one science plan in the country, in its history. And that was done in the 70s under Mrs. Gandhi's regime, right? 1,800 people, user ministries, the planning commission, scientific institutions, and industry, sitting together over a period of 18 months to 24 months, and coming up with a comprehensive plan as to how to take research happening in the institutions and in the CSIR through planning commission allocation of money to the user ministries. We haven't seen anything on this scale before or after in this country. Problem was, as soon as Mrs. Gandhi implemented the plan, she also implemented the emergency. And then, when the emergency was pulled back, the Morarji Desai regime decided that India did not need this. So the argument you're talking about of scale back on technology or technology as a solution to the social, political, and other problems that India had was more the Janata regime and not Mrs. Gandhi, Mrs. Gandhi's regime. So I think one needs to just make that sort of, small distinction because this was, this was simply not true at the time.
Just jumping in. 45 years after that, we're still saying, renewable, sustainable, use resources more carefully. So, we didn't... And
the current Prime Minister has no excuse because he is, unlike any of the political leaders before him who faced constraints about the availability of technology, this establishment faces nothing of that sort. And to now harp on alternative and renewable technology is just, criminal.
No, and scale can be in different ways. Right? So if in every village you had converted the compost heap and the the gobar gas into piped connections to every home, you would have had a very different outcome, and that would be scale in its own way, right? It's not large scale, but it is reaching everybody. That's
so replicability, right? I mean, scalability is not necessarily increase in numbers. There's also a replicability aspect of scale where you can take something and replicate it elsewhere.
Just a quick note on, so we are talking about government and policy and plan and all that. I think we're sitting in Bangalore, There's enough venture capital money flying around. To me, one of the biggest drawbacks that India needs to grapple with and overcome is funding. So the economics of entrepreneurship. See, if I'm in the US and I have an idea, just to prove the feasibility of the idea, I can get $100,000 easily. And then to commercialize it, up to $500,000. If I'm in Europe, they put out almost 80 billion euros every 2 to 3 years, 80 billion euros for research and innovation. In India, we have none of that. For example, in Bangalore, we have a young company which has come up with green propulsion. There are only 3 companies in the entire world, one in Sweden, one in the US, and one in Bangalore. But we don't have private money with appetite for risk, right? So I think on one hand, we're talking about the government, but we also have to see what's happening in the world of private capital. The other problem, in my view, I lived in California for 12 years, is that Silicon Valley has killed what I call genuine entrepreneurship. It's all about exit strategies and IPOs. So look at India. In the last 20 years, which new big companies have we created? Ola, Flipkart? Where are companies where we can actually show that we are building real products? None. None at all, if you think about it. It's all about the service industry. It's all about valuation. It's all about the exit strategy slide. So I think Silicon Valley has its pluses, but also the fact that it's killed this thing around real innovation. I'm not saying it's not happening there, but look at Bangalore. Why are we not seeing companies building real products? Of course, we have an electric scooter now, and I'm very proud of that. We need more of that. We definitely need more of that.
I think I totally agree. It's just to say that, the same strand of culture, if you will, led to different outcomes in different parts of the... Now, I agree. I mean, Rahul too mentioned this. To me, it was not known, so something that the book certainly missed. But a plan is a plan as long as it remains on paper. The fact is that there was nothing that was happening by way of material developments during this decade that would lead the government or lead an outside observer to say that something was happening by way of the government advocating big pushes in technology. That said, what was remarkable to me while writing this book was the fact that this factoid that comes, it is in a book on the history of computing in India by C.R. Subramanian, who says that the import of computers to India tripled during the years of the emergency. And for my life, I cannot imagine why the import of computers tripled during this period. But it just goes to show that despite the anti-automation protests of the 60s and 70s, and also remember 78 is the year that IBM quit India for whatever reason. And despite the fact that there was all of these things going on, there was beginning to be this kind of gradual embrace of technology, which really takes off from the 80s. So I agree with you there. And from the 80s and of course with the moment of liberalization in 1991, it is a different story altogether. But the fact is that some of these legacies still continue to haunt us, whether it is popular protests against nuclear plants, which really came of age in the 60s and 70s, not just in India, but also in other parts of the world. So some of that really bore on India as well, and I believe continue to the debate on genetically modified crops. Right? Now, if you ask the person who really has a strong opinion on these subjects, I really wonder whether he or she would have a clear idea of what the technology is. But they evoke such strong views, and perhaps some of it is the constant politicization of the virtues and vices of this technology.
And that brings me to another specific incident that you mentioned is the Human Genome Project. You talked about genetics and how the kind of resistance that it faced. And you also say that perhaps it's cultural, really comes from a long way back. So do you think that this kind of resistance, just for cultural reasons, to something at the cutting edge of technology still persists? You think we are still not open enough, despite perhaps lots of evidence to the contrary of the value of that particular area of research?
I really don't know. I've been saying this throughout. As we move closer to the present, the historian becomes irrelevant, and I lose all wisdom of hindsight. So, and I suppose it is a fact that we regretted the decision not to join the Human Genome Project almost immediately after the decision was made. Then folks like PM Bhargava critiqued the scientists. And this was a decision made by the scientists, not the political masters of the time, to stay out of the Human Genome Project. Now, you can again, of course, say that there were many reasons. And I have to sort of digress on this. One of the reasons why there was such opposition to the Human Genome Project in the early 90s, when it was the hand of invitation was extended to the Indian government, was because the Vaccine Action Program had been signed by Rajeev Gandhi and Ronald Reagan just a few years ago. It ran into a great deal of controversy from within government and outside government. Defense Ministry officials said that, here is an effort to take DNA material from Indians. It will be turned against India as some sort of agent of biological warfare. All sorts of rubbish. Adding to the fact that the US too, some private institutes in the United States too, were involved in smuggling anti-rabies vaccine to developing countries without the knowledge of the government. So all of this spooked the scientific establishment, which the book argues led to our staying away from the Human Genome Project. Of course, there is perhaps a cultural argument, but although I make it tongue-in-cheek, which is that we are subscribers of Advaita philosophy, so there's no need to study what is inside us as long as you study what is outside. But that's just a joke aside. If you notice, there has been this report that came in the Hindu a couple of weeks ago about a study that involved bat hunters in Nagaland, which was conducted jointly by the NCPS, which is a reputed institution in Bangalore, the rather unfortunately titled Wuhan Institute of Virology, and Duke University in the United States. This was done far before Corona and all of that controversies broke out. But the fact that DNA material was extracted from Indian subjects without the permission of the ICMR, the Indian Council of Medical Research, essentially led to this being brought under the scrutiny of the Home Ministry and the concerned authorities. And this is essentially a legacy that goes back to the 80s and are not joining the human. Of course, that was the outcome there. The ICMR regulations that were enacted preventing DNA material from being extracted from Indian subjects without permission was enacted in 1992. So India provided no assistance to the Human Genome Project. If the scientists involved in the project had to take material from Indians, they had to do it with persons of Indian origin in the UK and the US. And we missed the bus. And today we say we are able to map the genome of some man from Jharkhand at a fraction of the cost. It is at a fraction of the cost because most of the work has been done before us by scientists. So there is some historical legacy there which unfortunately continues to haunt us.
Speaking of science and spooking, and I've met scientists right here in Bangalore who are superstitious, who won't talk about the mission until it happens. What if it fails? So I'm like, I always wonder why ISRO doesn't share about its various programs as much as NASA does or ESA does. I still don't have a good answer. Sometimes they'll tell you, oh, everyone who needs to know knows. But I think there is a bit of religion, there's a bit of superstition. All of that comes in, and it's kind of weird. You would think a scientist wouldn't behave that way. There are anecdotes of if the chairman doesn't want to go to Tirupati after a launch, it is seen as, oh my goodness. So you should send a proxy, just to be in the clear. So science, I think it's very funny. I've met scientists, it just spooks me actually. I don't get it.
There's very little to say to that, but I think there's also a little bit of politics to it, right? I mean, the information that NASA or ESA shares, there's also very, very, very strong politics of sharing. What's shared and not shared, there are very clear divides on it, right? Like, I mean, if those of us who worked in classified and unclassified and declassified archives know the horror of the redacted pages with, 3/4 of it blacked out because that information is not shareable even 70 years after the fact, right? So I think there is also some element of that. And so, there are some, we are suspicious, right? Like the polity is suspicious. And those suspicions are often grounded on various historically sort of precedents. So one of my PhD students worked on the history of population control in India. And at a point of time when the Indian government did not want to import, so I won't tell you the full story. For those of you who want to read it, we can look at her thesis. Did not want to import contraception or birth control devices from the United States. But the Rockefeller Foundation was hell-bent on making sure those reached India. And they reached India in packaged as Christmas decorations. And they were introduced into the Indian market, right? Now, clearly, I'm sure the people in the government knew this happened, right? So there is, so all of those things, cultural and non-cultural notwithstanding, there's also politics to it. And there are historical incidents which, we have a history of about, if you begin with Robert Clive, about 300 years of building suspicion. To dismantle that kind of suspicion is going to take lots of work. I mean, I'm not saying that it's a good thing to not have participated in the Human Genome Project, or that it's not a good thing to share, yet that we embark on certain projects. But I think we might be erring on the side of caution. That might be a possibility.
I mean, look at the Chandrayaan landing, right? So there was a techie somewhere in Chennai who looked at some NASA imagery, and he figured out where the parts of Vikram were. And when that news came out, ISRO immediately came out and said, yeah, we already know that. Instead of saying, wow, well done, they said, oh, we already have that information. It's just that we didn't share it with you. So I think, speaking of scientific temper, which is a term we've been using since the 40s, that's not exactly encouraging the scientific temper of the techie in Chennai who took the trouble of going through the imagery and saying exactly where he found the pieces. I think ISRO should have given him a pat on the back. Similarly with Team Indus, I'm sure many of you have heard of Team Indus, right? Of the 26-odd Google Lunar X Prize contestants, Team Indus was in the top 3 in the world, right? And the Israeli team, which was also in the top 3, actually attempted a lunar mission, and it crash-landed before Vikram did. It was called Bereshit. And Netanyahu was in the mission control cheering the team. Team Indus was in Bangalore. Have you ever heard anyone from ISRO officially giving them a pat on the back? No. So again, a cultural issue. I think there is something wrong here. To not publicly acknowledge one of your finest teams, even if they fail and crash land, it doesn't matter. We just don't do that,
No, I think scientific establishment is very remote from the rest of us. Right. We venerate them, certainly. And Karnataka, we even have a Bharat Ratna, who is a senior scientist, C.N.R. Rao, things like that. But we actually know nothing because there's not much bridge building that actually takes place. And about the Human Genome Project and things of that sort, we always had simultaneously explorations of the ethical, legal, social implications. There was a whole other project. I don't think, as now, when we're seeing facial recognition being used to monitor who's protesting against the government, we start to get very, very worried about where technologies can be harnessed without thinking through all the other safeguards that go along. And of course, we don't want to import Huawei equipment because now some of these concerns are probably true also. Who knows? Yeah.
So I'm conscious of the time, so I'll just fast forward. And of course, this is it's a good thing we're not going through the entire book because it really needs to be read. But just to come to the very end of it, on this issue of technocrats versus politicians as leaders and as sort of the trailblazers in the field of technology. You speak a lot about, Arun, about technocrats, right, from Visvesvara to Nandan Nilekani, and give them a preeminent position and seem to suggest that, being led by them is a good thing. Right? Well, maybe.
It's only to trace the different kinds of technocracies that existed in India. And, by, of course, the fact that they feature in the book, and I try to use a three-pronged criteria that they should not have, I forget what the criteria are right now, but essentially one of them involved recognition of your peers and that you should have occupied some position within government. So a broad field is narrowed in some respects, but also for the fact that there are different kinds of technocracies. The 3 people surveyed in the book are Visvesvaraya, Sarabhai, and Nandan Nilekani. And they forged 3 different organizational structures within government, all within government, of course, Visvesvaraya before independence. And they had different views of technology. They were also, I wouldn't say they were all political animals, but they certainly had a good appreciation of politics, which was crucial to their success. So it is in that context that I talk about Vishwesvaraya and how he, for example, was very astutely a navigator of colonial era politics, but then resigned as the Diwan of Mysore over what he perceived as anti-Brahmin protests in the Madras presidency and the threat of spilling that over into Mysore. And finally, after independence, his views totally are marginalized by the establishment of the time. Sarabhai, somebody who was in currency throughout, but also in many respects was able to tell the leadership what they wanted to hear. And also at the same time insulate his own team from politics to the extent that now ISRO has, I believe, a separate recruitment process. There's some degree of autonomy that was built in thanks to the work of folks like Sarabhai. Nandan Nilekani's work on Aadhaar goes the exact opposite way. I mean, he is very clear that he does not want scientists or technologists running the program beyond the infancy. He was very sure at the beginning that an IAS officer should be running the UI, the unique identity. Now, we can debate the merits of that decision, but the fact is that that in his view and the view of the team, the technocracy could only survive if it was built from and continued from within government, rather than getting, say, when Sarabhai died, Satish Dhawan was bought from Caltech to run ISRO. And it was very clear that for the folks behind Aadhaar, that model would not have survived.
So just one last thing is that despite all of these problems, you do at some point strike a very rousing note when you say the gilded age of Koramangalam is here. So that's something to cheer about. And for the rest of it, of course, everyone should read. Now I'll open the floor for questions. Please introduce yourself, and please, in the interest of time, make your question very precise and very brief. Thank you.
Friends, I'm delighted about this evening. Thank you very much for the excellent presentation and what followed. In the entire discussion, all of you took one name, Nehru, but I will add 5 more names to that and then say something. In the economic and political decisions of India, especially 60s and 70s, since I had a lot of things to do with that, J.C. Kumarappa and Tagore and Nehru, these 3 people, what they said, what they wrote about after visiting Soviet Union, had a great influence on Indian political economic decision. In the science and technology area,
sir, may I interrupt for you to fast forward to your question? What is your question?
I will ask question.
Okay, because we have a few other questions also,
But then,
not to cut you short.
Dr. C.V. Raman, Vikram Sarabhai, and Dr. Bhabha, they have a lot of things to do in the formation of the science and technology. So my question today is, why do we compare India with any country in the world? We had a specific situation in 1947. You have analyzed it very well. We need to look at, from that point of view, to the future of India. But we will never go beyond our karma and moksha theory. We have to demolish many of our existing institutions, psychologically, philosophically, economically, to move forward. That is our task. Thank you very much, and all of you have done wonderful work. One last question. That everybody criticizes Indira Gandhi. If she did not, at midnight, dismiss Morarji Desai and nationalize banks of India, today we would have been where? Please discuss these things together. Thank you.
I just wanted to pick up on this. See, counterfactually, if we had not separated our research institutions from universities, would we have had like the Americans do, would we have had a very, very different trajectory in terms of culture, approach, outcome, everything else? But we're still continuing on that path. That's the
interesting counterfact.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah. So I'm a product designer. So I wanted to ask this one question. I feel, it may be my assumption, but I feel that the fact that in India there is no common platform of transdisciplinary studies is also the problem where technology is not being, adopted. See, technology is one thing, but you also need to ensure that it is it is something what people want. It is human-centric. The fact that solar cooker, I question who in the team even asked the actual user of the solar cooker how the cooker should be designed. So I think we need spaces like MIT Media Labs where there is probably an ethnographer, an anthropologist who understands people, communicating to the scientist as well as the designer. And I don't know, what are your aspects of it? Like today, I want to work for the government, but I cannot even find an appropriate job where I can be qualified to, like, you know, contribute. Like I've looked up Niti Aayog, I've looked up Kejriwal's government, everywhere. There is nothing that we are recruiting designers.
Okay,
It's
come
always,
to me.
Yeah.
Come to me. We are establishing Science Gallery Bengaluru, which is precisely meant to bring scholars from the humanities, scientists, artists all together on one singular platform with experimental spaces.
I think I'm an industrial designer and a product designer myself. I'll add something else. I think Nehru started NID back in the 60s with IMSS's thing. But again, about integrating research, private industry, and government. We completely missed that triangulation, which is why. But having said that, I was telling Jahnavi before coming in, for the longest time, it's almost been 20 years, a bunch of us around the world have been advocating for the NASAs and ESAs and ISROs of the world to hire industrial designers and architects and psychologists and color theorists. It's only engineers. So even today, if you want to work for NASA, you have to be an engineer or be hired in as a systems engineer. So it's a problem worldwide, despite having multidisciplinary landscapes abroad. It's all engineering-centric, not user-centric, not people-centric. You get my problem.
We'll take one last question, please.
I've got the mic, so I will. There was this, my name is Muralidhar Rao. There was this talk of privatization, and Dr. Gowda will identify me as the privatization propagandist. Now, Arvind Kejriwal government came back to power on, largely the power supply and the low price at which he's offering the power supply. And how did that happen? It happened because of privatization. And actually the credit should go to Madam Sheila Dikshit, your government, sir. In 2002, she went about it. And today, the T&D losses, transmission distribution losses, which was euphemistically called theft and dacoity losses, was something in the range of about 52%. It has today come down to less than 8%. And that made all the difference. And that is how Arvind Kejriwal government is able to afford the prices at the power at such low prices. Ironically, Karnataka government decades back had introduced this thing. I mean, in its policy, it is still there that privatization distribution should happen. But unfortunately, we still continue with our BESCOM monopoly. And I'm also the vice president of Bangalore Apartments Federation. In our apartment complex, we consume 360 liters of diesel every month. Extrapolating across the city, that works out to 11 million liters of diesel annually being blown up in smoke. The simple answer is, sir, you know it. Please do something about it.
Okay. Thank you all. There are many more questions, but unfortunately we've run out of time. Thank you very much. Thank you to our panelists.